A major family advocacy group in Canada has warned that Canadian PM Justin Trudeau is planning to abolish tax exemptions for churches, which would have major and in some cases irreversible effects on churches and societies. The controversial policy requires that employers sign an attestation that their core mandate respects abortion and transgender rights in order to receive Canada Summer Job Grants for students. Tax exemption is a contentious issue with churches because, especially in the case of the USA, the government allows certain charitable groups, such as churches, not to pay taxes in exchange for not participating in political life. This is by its very nature the church abandoning part of her role in society, as since she is the traditional second estate, she partakes of both the government and the people, while also standing between the two as a buffer. In this sense, it is impossible for the church not to take part in government. In spite of the claims of religious freedom and separation of church and state, this issue has never been solved with any church in any society. It is a greater problem for the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church is not a state church in the sense of Protestantism, nor has it ever been, where it is subjected wholly to the government. Even in the most favorable times to her, the Church has always occupied a contentious place in society, because she is not and cannot be reduced to a mouthpiece of the ruling classes by her very nature. This was also the reason behind the support of the Protestant Revolution centuries ago by many European noblemen, for since they wanted the religious authority to give moral license and rule to their actions, they sought to subvert the place of the Church under the thumb of government. Now, this problem can and also has happened with smaller Protestant churches, specifically in societies where one specific Protestant denomination is recognized by the state and others exist within it. America has been able to avoid this situation by influencing the perception and the beliefs of the people in society without interfering in changing the actual beliefs of churches. For example, Christians will claim to be American and support popular ideas about abortion or birth control, while at the same time being members of churches whose conditions of belief are in direct contradiction to those personal beliefs they hold. It's also achieved by ignoring questions of absolute truth, by saying that it does not matter if there is a difference between Catholics or different Protestant groups, or even between Protestant sects, since all people share a nebulous belief in Jesus and a common cultural Christianity. Both of these approaches have worked at keeping a general control on the disagreement and fighting that would have happened if they were addressed in society. However, what this has done is to replicate the same effects of the Protestant movement, but in a different way. In Europe, Protestantism led to the creation of the state churches, which then brought about the rise of a cultural religion tied to a church, but not necessarily to a belief in God, for belief in God and being a good Christian was synonymous with good citizenry. Now, this is passing away to a lack of belief in anything. In America, the promotion of such a cultural Christianity based on shared American values has led to the same new atheism by reducing Christianity to a shared set of values that are able to be changed with the social ethos of the times. The logic in the mind of the common man is simple. If churches are merely social organizations, and since most social and charitable organizations pay taxes, what makes the churches special? The reality, however, is that most churches could not survive without the tax-exempt status, because the taxes levied upon them for their properties by government would be so onerous that it would be impossible for them to pay without seriously curtailing their current ministries, if, that is, they could even still pay them at all. The result? A massive confiscation of church properties and wealth by the government using legal means as opposed to direct seizure, thus giving cover of legitimacy to what is an inherently sinister act. Now, it is true that there has been abuse by members of churches with government programs and tax subsidies. Only a fool or sinister person would deny this, as there are many stories about it. Even the Protestant Revolution used the abuse of church tithes and the selling of indulgences as an excuse for their revolt and formation of nationalist churches. If you want to read a good story about this, look up this story of the Dominican monk Johann Tetzel and his famous line, "When the coin in the coffer springs, the soul, when the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." He was accused of selling indulgences. However, far from healing the problems that existed, the Protestant Revolution made them worse, as the reformers, including John Calvin himself, gave explicit license to worst form of financial abuse, such as usury, which, while practiced unofficially by Catholics at the time, and was and still is a sin, Protestantism simply deemed it as not sinful and allowed its damaging effects to reverberate throughout society without any means of controlling them. While the tax exemption laws in Canada are far from ideal, or what they should be regarding the church in any society, and abuses do happen, they are still something that allows for Christians to carry out their witness to Christ in society. To eliminate tax exemption would be a direct assault on all churches, as it would shut down their ministries and by extension disband, to a large extent, the communities built around these institutions. It is the analogy of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Likewise, the movements taking place in Canada right now are also a warning to the USA. For just as American culture follows the cultural changes that begin in Europe so many times, given that Canada is between America and Europe, changes there often take place in the USA, and sometimes even more quickly. Europe has not eliminated her tax-exempt status for churches, albeit it is slightly different than the American situation, because while there is a general hatred of Christianity at large in Europe, the historical relationship and depth which the church possesses and is for the most part ingrained into the society has, in conjunction with the grace of God, prevented, for the time, further damage from taking place. Canada, however, being a part of the New World, and with a history of its people and religion similar to the USA, would be more likely to interfere in matters of church and state and taxes, if it is believed to be politically expedient to do so. The attack on the tax-exempt status of the churches could come from a number of sources, but given the sociocultural climate, it will most likely come from the LGBT. Using hate laws in combination with judicial activism, the LGBT has openly stated their intention is to silence the voice of religious groups who criticize them and eventually being able to compel them to submission or force them out of public life with the accusations of using anti-LGBT hate speech and labeling such institutions as hate groups and therefore ineligible for tax exemption. What could the controversies be that would give rise to this with the LGBT? The most likely candidate for this would be the so-called gay marriage. Homosexual unions are in direct conflict with Christian moral teaching. This is a known fact, it has always been, and in spite of anybody's attempt to say otherwise, it will always be such. However, a majority of people in Western society support homosexual unions and the so-called homosexual marriage. Therefore, in the name of upholding civil rights and in the name of preventing violations of federal law, this is the most likely candidate for stripping the tax exemptions from churches. Regardless of the means by which it's realized, the end is the same, which is the destruction of the Christian presence in public life and a relegation of holding the name of Christian to the taboo. The horrors of the old world have now arrived in the new world, and they are being progressively realized. What must not be underestimated, however, at the same time, and especially in the United States, is the American ruthlessness at exterminating things deemed to be undesirable. For example, centuries ago, America had a large slave population, and these slaves were known to revolt. Slave revolts were put down violently and quickly so that they progressively decreased in number due to the brutal force. The American Indians have a similar story, for while they resisted the expansion of the United States government, the Indian tribes were eventually forcibly rounded up, and those who were not exterminated were put into the first ghettos, what we call reservations, and many of them still live there today in poverty, misery, and on perpetual government dependence. Likewise, during the 1860s, a group of states wanted to secede legally from the current union and form their own nation. They had every right to do this under the Constitution. However, the government did not want this. After a brutal civil war that destroyed many of the states completely, including burning the entire state of Georgia to the ground, the government then military occupied the southern states and subjugated the people to such an extent of propaganda and rebuilding that the same states who rebelled, while today they will speak of secession, are also the biggest supporters of the military that subjugated them. Likewise, there came a time in American society that certain classes were deemed to be protected. This was during the 1960s, especially in regard to race relations. Yet what has happened since then? What has happened is a decline in race relations that, in spite of real problems that existed at the time, which were consistently, albeit slowly, improving, we have now the creation of a permanent underclass through the encouragement of socialized handouts and welfare programs. As the Pew Research Forum noted in a 2017 poll, 62% of Americans favor homosexual marriage, 35% are against it. If we break this down to raw numbers, there are 5 people in support of homosexual marriage, whereas there are 3 against it. If we take a look at this by generation, the numbers become even more serious. All generations born after 1945, the boomers, Gen X, and millennials, support homosexual marriage by increasing percentages of 56%, 65%, and 74%. Among the Generation Z, while statistics are still coming in for them, it looks like the numbers will be even higher. The silent generation, those born before 1945, are the only ones who are opposed to it by a majority, and they only have 41% in support of it. The silent generation, though, is dying off. The boomers are also heading on their way out too. Slower, but they still are. If we consider only Generation X and millennials, those in favor of homosexual marriage outnumber those opposed by a 2-to-1 minimum. If we consider the example of the USA that I've given above, in combination with the support of homosexual marriage, we can see that when the USA makes a significant social change, it does so with full force and in the intent to change society. Given the fact that homosexual marriage is being tied up with discrimination, federal law, and the past history of American life and social change, we can say it is only a matter of time before the tax-exempt status of the churches are challenged on this basis. And most likely the LGBT is going to win, because they have the support of the supermajority of society. One might think that Christianity itself could not be forced underground in America, but never say never. Remember that America was founded by Anglo-Saxons, whose grandparents and great-grandparents, less than a century before coming to the USA, in either the North Carolina, Virginia, or Massachusetts colonies, participated willingly in annihilating the Catholic Church throughout much of the British Isles because their king at the time, Henry VIII, was angry with the Pope for telling him that he cannot keep getting successive divorces. History always has an uncanny way of repeating itself. For times change, but people do not, and as such, Christians must beware.